So in this part of the discussion, we're going to talk about creating solutions. We're going to talk about some words that describe solutions, and then we're going to actually look at the steps to create a solution. So before we actually look at making a solution, we want to look at a couple different terms. So we're going to look at soluble versus insoluble and miscible versus immiscible. So soluble is when you have a solid that's able to dissolve in any solvent. So we might think of something dissolving in water. Water would be the solvent in that case. So an example of a soluble substance is sugar. Sugar can dissolve in water. So it is soluble. Insoluble is something that does not dissolve in a solvent. So for example, sand is insoluble in water. Again, the solvent that we're looking at is water. Miscible versus immiscible is looking at mixing liquids together. So if you have two liquids that are soluble in each other, you have two things that mix together, that's miscible. So an example would be water and rubbing alcohol. Water and rubbing alcohol will mix together, those are miscible. So immiscible is when you have two liquids that might mix together temporarily, but then they're going to separate back out. So an example would be oil and water. Oil and water, you can mix them for a short time, and then if it sits, they're going to separate out. So like Italian dressing. You have to mix the Italian dressing together because that's oil and vinegar. Those don't mix. You mix it together temporarily, they'll mix and then separate back out. So next thing we're going to look at is how to actually make a solution. So we're going to look at each of the steps to create a solution. So you have to be given some solute to use as well as a target molarity. So the first thing you're going to do is pick a volumetric flask to use. Now when you're looking for volumetric flasks, you want to think about what volume you need. So you can have anything from 1,000 milliliter volumetric flask down to 100 milliliter volumetric flask. Notice the only line on these volumetric flasks is somewhere on the neck of the flask. These are always what you use to make solutions. So you figure out what volume you need. So if you need 1,000 milliliters of something, you're going to use the 1,000 milliliter volumetric flask. So then the next step is you're going to use the given molarity and the volume of the flask to figure out how many moles of solute you need. So the whole point of making this solution is to figure out how much solute you have to measure out and dissolve. So you're going to use your molarity, and that equals moles over liters, and then you're going to solve for moles. Now once you solve for moles, you have to convert moles to grams using the molar mass of the solute. The reason that you need to go to grams is because in the lab we have to use an electronic scale or a balance, and that only measures in grams. So once you convert moles to grams, you're going to actually measure out that mass of solid. Then you're going to pour the solute into the volumetric flask. So there's nothing in this flask yet, but then you're going to pour the solid so that it's in the bottom of this volumetric flask. Once you have the solid in the flask, then you're going to add enough distilled water, so distilled being the key word here. You don't want any extra contamination, so you're going to use distilled water. So you're going to add enough water to the flask so that you can dissolve the solid. Now you're not going to fill up the flask completely. You're probably just going to fill maybe halfway up the flask, and then you're going to swirl it so that way you dissolve the solid. Now once the solid dissolves, you're going to add water up to this fill line, and then you'll make sure that it's mixed. Now this fill line is going to create the exact volume of solution needed. So if this were a 1,000 milliliter volumetric flask, this line creates exactly 1,000 milliliters or 1 liter of solution. So those are the steps that you go through to make a solution in the lab.